Support for Carolina Business Review made possible by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries, headquartered in Hartsville since 1899. And by Business North Carolina Magazine. There's a place for those who subscribe to the theory that business doesn't have to be boring.
Well, this past summer, Triangle Daily publication, the Durham Herald-Sun, had a headline that read, "Redistricting, the rise of metro politics." You know, we love a snappy phrase, and on some primal level, we seem to love to watch a good fight. Well, redistricting has plenty of both. Welcome back to the most widely watched source for Carolina business and public policy. On this edition, Redistricting in the Carolinas, or how it's formally known, reapportionment. What is it? Why is it important? And what are the facts beyond its politically polarizing rhetoric? Well, we start in just a moment with Louis Gossett from South Carolina Manufacturers Group, Ferrel Guillory from Chapel Hill's J School, and Jonathan Kappler from the Free Enterprise Foundation.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle-market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. And by Novant Health, a not-for-profit group of hospitals and physician clinics, ranked as one of our nation's 10 best healthcare systems, caring for patients and communities in North and South Carolina. Major funding also by King & Spalding, an international law firm with over 800 lawyers in 13 offices worldwide, providing legal services to clients in the Carolinas and throughout the world. For more information, visit www.kslaw.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded August 19, 2011. On this week's program, Louis Gossett of the South Carolina Manufacturers Alliance, Ferrel Guillory of the UNC School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and Jonathan Kappler of the North Carolina Free Enterprise Foundation. Now, Chris William.
Hello, welcome again to our program. Jonathan, good to have you on the program.
Thanks for having me.
Louis, what can I say? It's always nice having you up here.
Thank you.
And joining us from Chapel Hill, just next to his office in the journalism school, is Ferrel Guillory. Ferrel, welcome to the program. Good to have you there, too.
Thank you. Thanks for having me from Chapel Hill, where the students are streaming on the campus.
I was waiting for a good comment from somebody in Chapel Hill. Ferrel, let's start with you. You know, redistricting is one of these arcane political terms that we hear a lot of, but it also, you know, people's eyes glaze over and they think, well, not only don't I care, but is it something I really need to know about? Do we need to have a wider dialogue about the redistricting process while it's going on, and we are in the middle of it, right?
Yeah, obviously people need to know and pay attention, because the way districts are drawn sets the landscape of our democracy for a 10-year period. The Republican majority in the legislature did have some public hearings, but I think it's fair to say that most people, as you say, that their eyes glaze over. Public policy polling tested it, and about 40% of the respondents didn't have a view. And of those who had a view, 40% or so were opposed to what the legislature did, and only about 20% supported it. But I think all of that indicates, you know, how difficult it is for the public to focus on a process that's full of drawings and lines on a map and how they fit together.
You know, and Jonathan, we'll pull you into this. Is this something that needs to be done in the public? And believe me, I'm a proponent of open and free government, of course. Should it be done in the public, or should it be done not in a back room, but is it something that needs public input?
Well, one of the things that the Republican majorities, the Republicans ran on that helped them win majorities in the state legislature was saying they would bring in with them a sense of open and transparent government. And so I think this was a continuation of the redistricting process in North Carolina, having an opportunity for the public to speak out on the redistricting process and specific maps that were being proposed, the first time ever in history. I think that was probably a step in the right direction and helped differentiate those Republican majorities, these new, brand new Republican majorities, from their Democratic predecessors who had had majorities for 100 or so years.
And as South Carolina goes through it, because both states are going through it, every 10 years it's a mandate and have to go through the redistricting process. Is this process been easier in South Carolina this time around?
Well, it was easy up until a point. The big issue in South Carolina this year was that we gained a congressional seat through the census. And creating...
Okay, well, let me back up for just a second, Louis. So there's two types of redistricting. There's congressional, and then there's a legislative, which is a state level. And you're talking about a congressional redistricting.
Right. And of course, the General Assembly, it was an interesting process for us this year because that seventh seat, the question was, would it be centered in the PD region of South Carolina, Horry County over near the beach, Florence, that area, or would it be centered in the Low Country, Beaufort, Hilton Head, and so on? And that became the fight. The drawing of the lines for the General Assembly itself, for the House and the Senate, was a relatively calm process. But the fight, and where we actually did see public input in terms of whether it was ginned up or not, you never know, but we saw people at the General Assembly protesting whether or not the seat would be placed in the PD or whether it would be in the Low Country, and that became the real dilemma that South Carolina had.
And where did it end up going, and why should it have gone that way?
By and large, it is centered in the PD region.
Which is connected to Horry County.
Horry County, that's right, Florence. You know, there probably were some legitimate geographical concerns there, but South Carolina, as other southern states, being under the constraints imposed by the Voting Rights Act and having to deal with the Department of Justice on their maps, had to be very careful about how those were drawn. The courts are certainly going to look at our plan. But the real issue was whether or not certain members of the General Assembly were able to deliver their constituents a congressional seat. Now, there was an interesting development in the upstate, and I sort of took a little different view from some folks. Greenville County, which is one of the most Republican counties in the state, and one of the most business-oriented counties in the state, actually was split. And so Trey Gowdy, who represents the 4th Congressional District, which had been Greenville and Spartanburg and Union, lost part of Greenville County. Jeff Duncan, who represented the 3rd District, Lindsey Graham's old district, gained part of southern Greenville County. There were some folks up there that didn't want to see Greenville County get split. I viewed it a little differently. Greenville now has access to 2 congressmen, both who are considered to be rising stars in the United States Congress.
Well, you know, and it goes back to change. Ferrel, I want to say here that you can't have a redistricting dialogue without really talking about the advent of a super dynamic ability that now demographics play. Is that accurate?
Yes, and the power of computers and mapping technology has made it possible for legislators to cut districts down to the individual voter. And I think the maps in North Carolina, both the congressional map and the legislative maps, indicate how finely the Republican majority cut things. One of the aspects of redistricting that has not gotten much attention is the extent to which the legislature not only split counties, but also split precincts. And so there's some concern that if these maps are sustained through the judicial process, that there'll be some confusion at the polls because even one precinct, you will have districts with different, voters voting in different districts.
Jonathan, to Ferrel's point, can we get too granular when we're talking about splitting districts and splitting precincts and splitting a street, for that matter?
I think it all matters, actually. And the Republicans that were drawing the maps knew that, understand that. I think the Democrats that are in the majority that really didn't have any control over the process in North Carolina understood that they have very few arrows in their quiver to fight these Republican-drawn maps. And one of the things that they highlighted, as Ferrel said, is that there were a number of precincts that were split, much more than the current maps that we've used in the 2010 election. So to the extent that the courts will decide that that's an issue that is worthy of reconsideration and perhaps redrawing, we'll have to wait and see. And ultimately, that's where we're heading, is lawsuits and the Justice Department or the federal courts deciding as to whether or not the proposed maps are legal under the Voting Rights Act and other laws that govern redistricting.
Yeah, I want to ask you all this question. You know, and I know it can be a bit of a political hot potato, but is this time around for redrawing the maps, and certainly in North Carolina with a Republican-controlled legislature, and in South Carolina, same issue, is this any less partisan than it was 10 years ago?
Well, let me
Go ahead,
Ferrel.
Ferrel.
Yeah, let me weigh in on that. It's always partisan, and there's always politics. So let's put that aside. Then the question is, how was the partisanship played? How was the policy played out? And I think it's fair to say that the new Republican majority in the House and Senate in North Carolina tried to take advantage of its majority to the max. So let me just give you one illustration. North Carolina in 2008 voted for Barack Obama by a fairly narrow margin over John McCain. And it was an indication that this is a very narrowly divided state. If you look at the 13 congressional districts that the Republican majority has approved, that the legislature has approved, 10 of those districts, John McCain won. Only 3 of them, Barack Obama won. So the legislature took as many Democrats and packed them into certain districts. And so the Republican majority has given candidates of the Republican Party something of an advantage in many more districts now than they had 2 years ago.
So, go ahead.
That happened. Well, that was again looking at the two districts, the two possible districts for the 7th congressional seat
In South Carolina.
in South Carolina. You saw that dynamic within the Republican Party. There were folks within the Republican Party that were criticizing the General Assembly during that process, warning them that from their point of view, they were risking that seat being created as a Republican seat or as a prospective Republican seat. That either the districts that they were drawing weren't good enough, or that it would get into the courts and that the courts would wind up drawing the districts, and those districts would probably lead more to a perhaps 5-2 advantage for the Republicans in the congressional delegation, as opposed to what a lot of folks think will be a 6-1 advantage with what has now been approved by the General Assembly, and what we'll see whether or not it can get through the process.
Jonathan?
It's the tension that we're seeing in North Carolina. It apparently is the same in South Carolina, where the Republican majorities have been concentrating Democratic voters, and in a lot of cases in eastern North Carolina, and I'm sure in parts of South Carolina as well, that tends to mean African American voters into high concentration districts where African American voters are over 50% of the voting age population. And what that does is that creates several districts around it that are much more Republican. Now, the Democratic approach in the past has been to use effective majority-minority districts where you have African American voting age population between 40 and 50%, not expressly above 50%. And that had the opportunity for Democrats to win many more seats because their voters might have been spread out a little bit thinner amongst a variety of seats where that had the opportunity for them to win. And we're just not seeing that. The Republicans in the legislature in North Carolina have said that the law, they say, compels them to draw a majority-minority district where they have the ability to, and that's what they've done.
So, Ferrel, I want to come back to you. Besides this minority-majority demographic that clearly is a politically sensitive issue, how does rural and urban tie into this as well? How do the centers of influence when it comes to census versus those that aren't so?
Well, let me begin by building on what Jonathan was saying, is that North Carolina has been at the center of some of the major Supreme Court cases on redistricting, having to do with largely what's the obligation in terms of assuring Black voter participation and election. And I think that's going to be at issue again as this plays out in the court this year. Now to go specifically to your question, clearly there was both legislative and congressional redistricting reflect the metropolitanization of North Carolina, so that power is increasingly concentrated in the Piedmont Crescent, and specifically in the Research Triangle area and then the Charlotte metropolitan area. So the Wake County got a couple of additional state house seats. Mecklenburg got an additional seat. And as you look at the maps, you see that the eastern districts, largely rural, historically, have begun marching westward because they've had to stretch those districts, to meet the population. Renee Elmer's district, the second congressional district, she's the new Republican member of the House. The second district has historically been an eastern rural district, but under the new map, it's almost all west of Raleigh, south and west of Raleigh now.
So what Ferrel, I want to stay with you on this. What happens to the white Democrat business person in the eastern part of North Carolina, and what happens to the influence that they have, let's face it, historically had in this state for a long time?
Yeah, well, I think one of the stories of the shift in politics in North Carolina is that those rural districts, particularly the majority white rural districts, are becoming increasingly Republican. And Democratic strength is growing in the metropolitan areas. And the metropolitan areas would dominate state politics were it not for the two-party competition between Democrats and Republicans, so that the metro areas don't speak with one political voice, but they are divided within themselves. But the Democratic Party is becoming much more the metropolitan party in this state, and particularly in the east, the white rural districts are becoming increasingly Republican.
How does that pan out in South Carolina?
It sounds like they've seen something of what we've seen. When you get to the state house districts, whether it be the House or the Senate, particularly the Senate, we had a lot of districts that had lost population. More of the rural, traditionally Democratic seats had lost population. And
to what? To the urban centers?
To the urban centers. And if you look at the places that it looks like gain seats, you've got Coastal and you've got York County, which is right below Charlotte. But the bottom line is some of those districts had lost population, and it was extremely difficult, from what I was told by the folks who were actually working on the maps, to draw the maps, to get enough people in certain districts. And you had some members of the General Assembly whose districts had grown dramatically, and they had to lose substantial numbers of people in order to get the numbers right, and others who were desperately clamoring for enough folks to continue to fill their districts. We had a little bit of folks getting put in districts against each other, incumbents getting put in districts against each other. Some of that, there are some issues, I think, that will emerge, and it'll all really turn out in the next election as to really what the effect of this was. But you've got a question as to whether or not some white Democrats can survive in the districts that were drawn for them. But by and large, I think from the state house perspective, probably nibbling around the edges. I don't think the redistricting is going to change the numbers that dramatically. The Republicans have a pretty solid majority in both houses. I think you may see some nibbling along the edges. The real fight in South Carolina was the congressional district.
I just want to add that I think that in North Carolina, this has the opportunity to fundamentally change the state's politics, where you've seen in the past, as you alluded to.
You mean internal to the politics, Jonathan, or external to what North Carolina means to the national?
Internal in North Carolina, who is going to be the next governor of North Carolina, who are going to be our statewide elected leaders, who are going to be our federal representatives. I think white Southern Democrats, traditionally moderate or conservative Democrats, have done well in North Carolina statewide politics. They've won the governor's mansion, they've been attorney general, they've been lieutenant governors, they've won U.S. Senate seats. And with this shift of population towards the urban areas, and with the Republicans controlling the redistricting process and drawing these new boundaries, where rural districts now are going to be more Republican, and urban districts are tending to become more divided between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats tend to have a little bit of an edge there. You're going to have a Democratic Party, I think, that mirrors more South Carolina's Democratic Party, where it's dominated by urban white Democrats and African-American rural Democrats. And whether or not they'll be able to cobble together a coalition to create majorities in the General Assembly, I think, is going to be more difficult than it has been in the past.
So what happens, Ferrel, I want to start with you, and Jonathan, I'd like you to comment on this because it's a North Carolina issue, Lewis, and you can, but I don't know that you'll want to. What happens to a state like North Carolina that has been thought of, and I wouldn't say traditionally as much as in recent history, has been thought of kind of the firewall for the Democrats nationally? Certainly when it came down to the last presidential election, it was important to the Democrats. And this idea with the DNC now announcing their Charlotte intent, what happens to North Carolina through this redistricting process in that case?
Well, I think North Carolina remains a competitive state. The Democratic Party in North Carolina is much stronger overall than the Democratic Party in South Carolina. And, you look at exit polls, you look at the vast array of survey research that goes on, and you see in North Carolina about 40% of people think of themselves as Democrats. About 40 or so think of themselves as Republicans. And the real growth has been independent and unaffiliated voters, about 20%, and in some urban and metro counties, even more than 20% think of themselves as independents, meaning that they are up for grabs. And so the victory of Barack Obama and Beverly Perdue in the governor's race in 2008 indicated that that North Carolina is going to remain a competitive state, and a lot of the future of the politics will depend on the speed, the acceleration of the metropolitanization, and how those big population centers change over time with in-migration and increasing racial and ethnic diversity.
And sorry to interrupt you, but let me go back to something. You said the Democratic Party in North Carolina is stronger than the Democratic Party in South Carolina. In what way, Ferrel? In the way that South Carolina Democrats are more moderate, or they're just more numbers, or how?
Well, you look at, North Carolina has had 5 consecutive victories by a Democrat running for governor. And South Carolina hasn't had a Democratic governor in a couple of decades. That's just an easy illustration. North Carolina, because of its robust population growth, its, as I continue to say, its metropolitanization, has attracted into the state a lot of voters who may be fiscally conservative, business-oriented, but they also want good schools and bike paths and good health care and some of the infrastructure the government provides. And so those voters are pushed and pulled between Democrats and Republicans, and Democrats still have some appeal. Also, the Democratic Party in North Carolina has sustained business support in ways that Democrats have not sustained business support in other states in the South.
Lewis, question, comment?
Well, I think that North Carolina seems to be going through a process that we've been through in South Carolina. A lot of what's being discussed here in terms of the dynamics of the reapportionment, South Carolina looked at in the 90s and 2000. And so in terms of, we made the shift from a state that had been dominated by the Democratic Party for 100 years to a state where the Republicans had control of both houses of the General Assembly. It's been 8 or 9 years since Senator Vern Smith switched parties and gave the control of the Senate to the Republicans. So that's gone on in South Carolina for quite some time, whereas other southeastern states are just experiencing this. The Democratic Party in South Carolina certainly has had its challenges. They don't hold any constitutional offices right now in the state at all, none of the statewide offices. They hold 1 member of Congress, no senators, and the minority party in both houses of the state house. That being said, we still enjoy quite a bit of support from a number of the members of the Democratic caucus in the House and the Senate for business issues.
Okay, we got about a minute left, and I want to get to this last thing. We have talked around the Justice Department's decision here. Jonathan, when do they have to make a decision on this first round of redistricting?
It was the rough time window was about 60 days from when the maps are submitted, and Republicans are hoping that this process will be expedited so that they can get the filing period finished in late January, early February, and then on to the May primary. But there will be inevitable lawsuits that will probably delay that in some way, shape, or form.
And they expect 9/10 of the time Justice Department says no on the first draft, isn't that?
Well, we've actually seen the Justice Department or federal courts go along with many southern states' redistricting plans. North Carolina is maybe more contentious than others, so we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Ferrel, thanks for being here from Chapel Hill. Always nice to, and
Thank
you're
you,
always
Chris.
welcome to join us in the studio too sometime.
Okay,
Louis,
I'll
good
do
to have
that.
you back here.
Thanks.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you for being on here with that
Appreciate
big
it.
Appalachian thing going on.
Thanks.
Good to see you. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton, an international accounting, tax, and business advisory organization dedicated to serving middle market companies. Grant Thornton, a passion for the business of accounting. And by Novant Health, a not-for-profit group of hospitals and physician clinics, ranked as one of our nation's 10 best healthcare systems, caring for patients and communities in North and South Carolina. Major funding also by King & Spalding, an international law firm with over 800 lawyers in 13 offices worldwide, providing legal services to clients in the Carolinas and throughout the world. For more information, visit www.kslaw.com. Additional funding provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. There's a place for those who subscribe to the theory that business doesn't have to be boring. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries, headquartered in Hartsville since 1899. And by viewers like you. Thank you. You may write us at Carolina Business Review, 3242 Commonwealth Avenue, Charlotte, North Carolina, 28205.